Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to our webinar. I'm Tessa Zant, Manager for Engagement at Christchurch City Council. This is our third webinar now, so thank you to those of us who have joined us for all of these events, and welcome to anyone joining us for the first time. Today we'll give you a bit more detail about the proposed zone provisions and new proposed qualifying matters for the District Plan Change 14. Next slide. Your mics and cameras are switched off so that we can keep the session moving. Thank you to those who have already sent in questions. The rest of you can also ask questions throughout the session by using the chat function, which is located at the top of your menu. If you're unable to use chat for any reason, you can email questions to engagement@ccc.govt.nz. Now, apologies if we don't get through all of the questions during the session. We didn't in December, or if we need to do a little bit more research to get them answered. We will upload a complete Q&A document to our website and email a link directly to the email address you used to sign up to this event. This is likely to be early next week. If you are hard of hearing or if you experience any sound issues, see the black image to the right of the screen. You can turn on live captions by clicking on the three small dots at the top of your screen above More, and then click Turn on Live Captions near the bottom of the drop-down list. You can do this at any point throughout the session. Please note that the session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website along with the Q&A early next week. I'm now going to hand you over to our technical team, Mark Stevenson, and David Hatton.
Thank you, Tessa. Next slide, please. So the purpose of today's webinar is to provide an update on proposed new qualifying matters that Council staff have been investigating. It's also to explain new provisions or changes to provisions that have been worked on since the version that was presented to Council in September. And last but not least, we'll also briefly show some updates to zoning. We'll then enable questions to be answered as Tessa explained, and we'll seek to answer as many as we can in the timeframe. It's worth noting that today we won't go over all the content that's been covered in the previous presentations to date. This is very much an update that builds on those webinars. Next slide, please. So it's worth just setting the scene and providing context to the plan change before we get into the detail. The direction that the Council is implementing as established through the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and in the enabling housing legislation is for intensification. That's some recognition that a consolidated or compact urban form is sought, and that aligns with planning that's happening at a sub-regional level. The Greater Christchurch Partnership is developing a spatial plan, and engagement on that is commencing shortly, which signals direction for a more compact urban form. It also reflects the direction that Council is taking in its own spatial planning, known as the Ōtautahi Christchurch Plan, and that acknowledges too that we need to grow up rather than outwards. Since the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, we've had a National Policy Statement on highly productive land, and that signals that land should be protected where it supports productive industries in the rural environment. The direction that we're implementing and the plan change reflects is to enable greatest heights in the central city with a graduated approach, such that our largest suburban centres provide for greater densities and height of development, and the smallest centres have a much lesser scale of development. And the function of those centres is then reflected in the densities and height enabled in the surrounding area adjoining those centres. The new qualifying matters that I'll describe seek to focus development around public transport routes, and that's in line with the emerging urban growth program and supports public transport viability, but it also enables increased accessibility to services and employment. Next slide, please. So just as a very brief overview, today we're going to talk through a number of new qualifying matters: sunlight access, public transport accessibility, property access to properties which are affected by natural hazards risks, including flooding and rockfall. We'll touch on work that's been done on tsunami risk and some additional qualifying matters, which I won't read out. We're also going to briefly summarise some of the key changes that have been made to the residential chapter since the September version, as well as provisions being introduced or amended for the specific purpose schools and hospital zones, which reflects the existing hospitals and schools or historical sites of hospitals and schools, which were to enable high or medium density response around. And then I'll go on to explain the changes to zoning and overlays. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand over now to Dave Hatton, who's going to talk to you about the first of those qualifying matters on sunlight access.
Thanks, Mark. So this qualifying matter is around sunlight access and recession planes, and it would introduce a tighter recession plane for Christchurch than in the MDRS. This is a matter that was of great concern to our community, and we feel there's a sound basis for introducing it. We have in Christchurch more sun hours than Auckland and other North Island cities, but we have lower ambient temperatures and lower sun angles. And the effect of that is that buildings will shade their neighbours more, but it also means that when the sun shines in winter, it hits the vertical plane of a window at a better angle, and we actually get more warming than in other cities. So sunlight is particularly effective in Christchurch in warming the inside of a house. The MDRS envelope is quite generous, and we think it's possible to reduce it through stricter recession planes without greatly affecting the amount of houses that can be built on a typical site. Sunlight also seems to be well understood by the market and valued, and so better sunlight access would come with an increase in the value of houses sold potentially. Have the next slide, please. A little bit of detail in some of the work that we've done in order to look at this matter. This is an example of how sun angles affect a development in Auckland. I'll be looking at a Christchurch example in a minute. The orientation of the site is very significant, and this example is looking at a site that faces east-west with houses built with outdoor living to the north. What's shown on the right side of the diagram is what happens when you have two rows of three-storey houses built next to each other, which is really probably what's expected in the planned environment. And what we're interested in is how one row affects the other. And so looking at the sun angles, you can see that in Auckland, in the winter solstice, that tight sun angle in the midwinter would mean that the upper floor is substantially shaded. But as you go through the year with the different sun angles as they improve, you find that at the equinox, the whole of the ground floor receives sunlight at some point during the day. What this means is for Auckland, that there's around about 3 to 4 months where a typical development would be shaded in winter. We have the next slide, please. So we did the same exercise in Christchurch to see what the difference was. And what we find there is, not surprisingly with our sun angles, that we get longer periods where there's no sun. So in this particular example, we would find that on the upper floor, you get the upper floor being shaded during the winter solstice, and you actually get the lower floor not receiving any sun at all for 5 to 6 months of the year. So significantly more shading in Christchurch than in Auckland, and also when you have living areas with no sun for nearly 6 months, that's not really creating the kind of city that people are expecting. The next slide. So we did the same exercise looking at different sites and different orientations. And what we generally find is that in Christchurch, there's around about a 20 to 25% difference in the amount of sunlight hours received when you have an MDRS style development built next door. That's the sort of 6-week shading on an east-west site. On a north-south site, you generally find that you get some sun every day, maybe only a couple of hours in the winter in Auckland, but in Christchurch, you'd only be getting an hour and a half. And what we're trying to achieve is a comparable living environment. And so we're trying to make that shaded area on the Christchurch diagram about the same size as the one in Auckland. And the proposed approach to do that is to introduce a stricter recession plane, a tighter angle, and a reduced height. So it varies from, in a similar way to the recession planes in Christchurch vary at the moment, from 3 meters, starting at 3 meters, and it goes from 50 degrees to 60 degrees. It's a slight increase in angle, or slightly tighter angle than what is proposed under the MDRS. But the difference it makes is reasonably significant because it overcomes that 20 to 30% difference in sunlight received compared to Auckland. Next slide. We looked at what difference that would make to capacity, and the top row is the MDRS, and what that shows is it's quite a generous development envelope. The height is more than you would typically need for a 3-story unit, and when you have all the other things that typically have to be on a site, the outdoor living, the access, potentially some parking, servicing, we usually find that you wouldn't be challenging the edges of that envelope. And what that means is there's quite a lot of scope to reduce the recession planes without really affecting capacity. So the ones that we are proposing, they would only really change things around the edges. And when we looked at it, we found that we can usually get about 95% of the development using the new recession planes we're proposing as what you'd get under the MDRS. Next slide, please. Just a quick word about the high density zone. So the recession planes we are proposing would apply to all zones. The difference in the high density zone is that above a certain height, then we would apply a setback rather than a recession plane. So if you were building a 3-story development, there would be no difference. But if you were looking at 6 stories, then the recession planes only apply to a height of 12 meters. And above that, there's a setback of 6 to 8 meters, depending on the orientation of the site. And the reason for that is that when you get to that height, the sun won't become visible above the building in the winter anyway. And so most of the sunlight you receive is going to be from oblique angles. And so it's more effective to start managing the setback of the building and its maximum length to make sure that there's some gaps between the buildings through which the sun can shine. And that's a slightly different approach in the high density zone, similar to what's done at present in the high density Carlton Mill zone. So it's a sort of an existing approach we're applying more generally. That's all I have. So be back to Mark.
Thank you, Dave. The next qualifying matter that's proposed, which we wanted to explain, is based on public transport accessibility. The qualifying matter, in a nutshell, is to limit intensification to areas that are within a walkable distance of core bus routes and other bus routes that Council has defined. That would have the effect of restricting development in other areas. The rationale for this qualifying matter is that it aligns with an investment strategy for public transport. So if we can focus growth and development in those corridors that are within a walkable distance of bus routes, we can maximise the patronage on those routes and support the viability of public transport. And as I outlined earlier, it also provides for increased accessibility to public transport by those living close. In doing so, it can reduce the use of private vehicles, or at least reliance on private vehicles. Naturally, it better achieves the outcomes sought by the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which signalled that intensification should be enabled in and around the city centre or within a walkable distance of the city centre zone, and also directed that intensification occurs in and around our commercial centres. Next slide, please. So this slide here has a number of colours on it. The areas that are orange represent parts of the city that are within a walkable distance of the core bus routes and other bus routes we've specified for the purpose of this QM. The purple areas represent those parts of the city that are beyond a walkable distance of the bus routes that we've specified. So in effect, the qualifying matter would apply to those areas shaded purple. That would limit the intensification within those areas shaded purple. In respect of the areas shaded red, that represents another qualifying matter which relates to the airport noise contour line and is included on this image for information only. It represents what was in the council's proposal in September. I should note that 800 metres has been defined as the walkable distance from the 5 core bus routes that were signalled in the Public Transport Futures business case. Notwithstanding that, we have also added 4 other bus routes which intensification would be enabled around. That includes the number 17 route to Brynwa, the number 29 route from Fendleton to the airport, the number 44 route from the city to Shirley, and the number 125 route between Redwood and Hallswell. All of these are on the basis that they connect employment centres together. There are those routes in question providing access between our suburban centres and the central city, as well as across town between individual centres and employment areas, particularly in that northwest quadrant. The orange area also reflects areas that are currently zoned in the operative district plan as residential medium density and residential suburban density transition zone. That has, as a consequence of this proposal, been translated into the medium density residential standards, which in doing so implements the medium density residential standards. The effect of the qualifying matter on those areas shaded purple is that it's effectively a low density residential zone in which residential suburban rules would apply. Notwithstanding that, we have retained as part of this qualifying matter the high density areas. So in our most accessible locations, we have a high density residential zone, and that's within a walkable distance of the city centre, but also around our largest centres, and that has not changed through this QM. Next slide, please. The next QM that I'd like to briefly describe relates to the key transport corridors north of the city centre and to the west and south of the city centre. They're to be referred to as the city spine, and there's a risk of medium density residential standards and the intensification enabled by the National Policy Statement compromising the outcomes for that city spine. Those 2 corridors are signalled for future investment in public transport, and over the long term we want to ensure a high amenity environment that has tree planting and sufficient space for a range of modes. The effect of the qualifying matter is to introduce a increased setback from the road boundary through the medium and high density residential zones of between 3 and 4 metres as compared to the 1.5 metre setback that applies under the medium density residential standards. I should note that the setback may not necessitate the acquisition of land. Its purpose is to provide sufficient space for wider improvements along those corridors, which may include tree planting in the front yard to provide a level of amenities. So it may be that it can be achieved whilst being retained in private ownership. Notwithstanding that, there is at a future date consideration that will need to be given to a designation to widen the road reserve in some locations, and that will be investigated and pursued separately. This QM is really about providing the opportunity to protect the future opportunities for the corridor that would otherwise be foreclosed if development was built 1.5 metres up to the road boundary. Next slide, please. The next qualifying matter I'd like to describe is the tsunami hazard. And on the image on the right-hand side, that's broadly speaking represented by the blue. The pink lines on that image represent areas around core bus routes. And as you can see, the extent of the tsunami area is extensive in terms of land that would otherwise be enabled for medium and high density. The data that has been obtained from NIWA increases the extent of the qualifying matter that was signalled in the draft presented in September. And the data is based on a 100-year horizon consistent with the national direction in the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. There are some assumptions made in terms of the extent of that area. For instance, it's based on the tsunami occurring at high tide. Notwithstanding that, we have removed some areas where the depth of water associated with the tsunami would be shallow in the order of 0.1 of a metre. In addition to that, a qualifying matter is being proposed which would restrict intensification on sites where the access is affected by one of a number of natural hazards. So the property itself may not be affected, but the access to enable safe evacuation would be impacted either by tsunami, coastal hazards, flood management from other sources, namely rainfall and river flooding, rockfall and cliff collapse. And so the consequence of that is that development within those areas would be restricted in a similar manner to properties that are directly affected by the hazard itself. So we are investigating that and pursuing that at this time. Next slide, please. The next qualifying matter I'd like to describe is the interface at the interface with industrial zones. There's recognition that residential zones adjoining industrial zones are generally enabled to 2 stories or 8 metres, which is consistent with a suburban zoning. With intensification enabled by medium density residential standards up to 3 stories, there is a risk of increased exposure to noise on the 3rd story, which isn't currently permitted. And that would not be mitigated by the existing industrial activities in the adjoining industrial zone. For example, the industrial activity in the adjoining industrial zone may have designed their mitigation of noise on the assumption that only 2 stories was enabled. This qualifying matter seeks to manage those effects, both reverse sensitivity effects, which is where someone moves in and complains about the noise from the adjoining industrial zone. It also seeks to manage the effects on the amenity of future residents, and the effect of the qualifying matter is to restrict 3-story developments within 120 metres of the industrial zone boundary. It is recognised that there are issues arising where the noise could be mitigated on the industrial side, and we will be investigating a plan change at a future date, which may introduce additional controls on the industrial zone, but that it's outside the scope of the intensification planning instrument and is therefore not part of Plan Change 14. Next slide, please. The Ōtākaro Avon River corridor. The map on the left-hand side of the slide, there's land to the east of Fitzgerald Avenue, which is grey, and that represents the specific purpose Ōtākaro Avon River corridor zone. The outcomes for that zone are defined in the Ōtākaro Avon River Corridor Regeneration Plan. Notwithstanding that, under the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, we're to enable at least 6 stories within a walkable distance of the city centre zone, and that red line represents the extent of that walkable distance. That covers the westernmost part of the corridor, and it's acknowledged that the vision and outcomes sought for the corridor is principally as a public open space and other activities associated with that, and that can be used as a qualifying matter to exclude the majority of that corridor for intensification. There are 3 exceptions where there are private properties held in private ownership, being 1, 2, and 3 on the map on the left-hand side. On the sites marked 2 and 3, the regeneration plan has identified features including stormwater management, as well as walking and cycling routes, which would be compromised if development was enabled on those sites. So we're proposing a qualifying matter that applies to those 2 sites, which is different from the qualifying matter that applies to the rest of the corridor, but will preclude intensification achieving the same outcome. The site numbered 1 on the map is land that has been subject to a private plan change request for enabling housing on it. We are proposing a qualifying matter that applies to that land as well, and that is based on natural hazards. Based on geotechnical advice, it's considered inappropriate to enable 6 stories as directed by the National Policy Statement, and what we're proposing as a response to that is that only 3 stories is enabled on that site. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Turning to residential controls, the preceding parts of the presentation I've talked about qualifying matters. This part of the presentation is in respect of controls that are in the residential chapter, but not by way of a qualifying matter. So these are updates that were made since the September version. The first point being that we're removing internal garage setbacks from the internal boundary, and that reflects the status quo. So effectively a garage could be built right up to the boundary, as can occur at the current time. The second point is that under the medium density residential standards, glazing is required of 20% on any site visible from the road. We consider that it's appropriate that further clarity is provided on that, and that the glazing requirement only applies to the first 12 metres of a parcel from the road boundary. That has the effect of requiring 20% glazing on the units that's closest to the road, but units that are further back from the road, behind one of the units, would not need to comply, on the basis that the benefit of glazing and the purpose of that glazing requirement is to provide that interaction with the street. The next change is the pathway for a higher site coverage within the high density residential zones. So the medium density residential standards prescribe that a site can have a maximum coverage of 50%, and we signalled in the draft that it could go up to 60%, but there's some additional requirements, and those are that there's no car parking present on the site, that there's tree and shrub planting and retention required of existing trees and shrubs, that the site has a minimum street frontage of 25 metres, acknowledging it will be a larger site, and there'd be a larger communal living area required. Also in the high density residential zone, there's also proposed to be a minimum requirement for 2 stories. That's to better support the outcomes anticipated in that zone of having higher density development. The risk being that if we don't have a minimum, then we could continue to see single-story buildings in a zone which is highly accessible to centres and the city centre, and can support the more efficient use of land. We're also introducing a maximum building length in the medium and high density zones, as well as reintroducing minimum unit sizes. The minimum unit sizes that are prescribed in the current district plan would effectively be carried over, and it's on the basis that those minimum unit sizes don't preclude the densities and height being achieved that is prescribed in the medium density residential standards. We're also making improvements to the residential design principles, which we can talk to if there's questions on that. In terms of the recession plan, David has spoken about that. In the September version, there was an exemption from the recession plane for the first 20 metres of a site from the road. So effectively, on the boundary with neighbours, there was no requirement to comply with the recession plane to encourage development to be up close to the road. We're reducing that recession plane exemption from the first 20 metres of the site to the first 14 metres of the site, and the exemption applies if 3 units are proposed rather than 2. The next change is a greater focus on adapting controls to better manage fire risk, especially on the Port Hills. That's proposed by way of a change to the minimum access width that is required for vehicles to any site. And at the moment, the current minimum does not facilitate a fire appliance entering a site. And with the risk of fire, particularly on the Port Hills, it's considered appropriate that we provide for that. And so that's a change we're putting forward. In terms of tree canopy cover, this is proposed to remain at 20% and would be payable as part of the subdivision process, as well as being required at the development stage if development precedes subdivision. So in the previous version, we'd proposed only subdivision rules. This change is to introduce it in the development stage such that in scenarios where development precedes subdivision, as I outlined, then it's payable at that instance rather than subdivision. Next slide, please. Now, these next few slides just explain some of the zone changes that we've made, recognising that the planning maps are still being updated, and these don't reflect the various recession plans that I have mentioned, most notably the sunlight access. The changes represented by the blue is where the zoning is proposed to change from high to medium density. And though there are some areas where there's a purple outline, like the image on the right, which represents areas that have been added in as high density rather than medium density. The image on the left is Linwood and shows areas that were defined as high density going to medium density, and the image on the right is Papanui, and on the western edge it highlights areas that are going from high to medium density, and on the eastern edge both additions and areas that are being changed from high to medium. It's worth noting in broad terms that the walkable catchments we've defined and which form the basis for the high density residential zone are based on Ōtautahi guidance and are divided into 200 metre increments. So around our largest town centres, the walkable catchment is 600 metres. Around our larger local centres and standard town centres, for instance, Linwood, as well as other centres such as Barrington, the walkable distance is 400 metres, and then around our medium local centres, it's a 200 metre walking catchment. We have the extent of the zone as per these examples does not reflect in all instances the exact walking distance measured that I've just described. They have been adjusted based on urban form context to provide a consistent and cohesive application. So in some instances, we've gone to the nearest road boundary, and in other instances, it's less than the walkable distance on the basis that it's a more logical form to define having regard to physical boundaries, physical infrastructure, the availability of public transport, and the function of the centre. Next slide, please. The image on the left is Church Corner, and that shows areas that have been added to the extent of the high density residential zone, the blue being areas that have been changed from high to medium. And as you can see, those areas provide for a more logical and coherent form. I will just move to the next slide. The image on the left is Hornby, and again, we've added areas and which reflects the context of those areas and sought to provide that coherence. The image on the right is North Horswell, which is emerging as a new centre, consented but yet to be developed, and we've added an area to the north of that. Next slide, please. I'm conscious of time, so we will get through the next few slides as quickly as we can to allow time for questions. The National Policy Statement on Urban Development does require us to enable intensification of more than just residential zones. It prescribes that we should enable intensification within a walkable distance of centres, and that includes the schools and hospitals which have a specific purpose zoning. Within a walkable distance of the city centre, we're to enable at least 6 stories unless a qualifying matter applies. And some schools and hospitals do fall within those walkable distances, and so we're enabling that. No, there is the former Christchurch Women's Hospital site within the 4 avenues, and we're proposing to enable increased height on that site, recognising its size, but also the surrounding context of what's enabled around it. Other affected hospital sites are listed there, and I won't read all those out. There are also a number of schools and some school sites where 10 stories is enabled consistent with the surrounding residential context. The risk being that if we don't enable 10 stories on those sites, in fact, the outcome is that the height and density enabled on the school sites is far less than what could be developed on the adjoining residential sites. The 3 sites that I've listed there, there are, of course, heritage buildings and items within those sites, and the heritage layers, the heritage items qualify matters in themselves, so would preclude that level of development. Next slide, please. Just briefly in terms of commercial and industrial rules, the industrial land at Milton Street is proposed to be rezoned from industrial to mixed use, and that aligns with the high density response in Sydenham to the immediate east and north. There are other changes proposed to the mixed use zone extent, relatively minor, and in the central city to the north, we're proposing that the extent of the area enabled to 10 stories is reduced. That would mean that the central city mixed use zone as currently exists would have areas that are enabled to 10 stories closest to the business zone, and then on the outer edges it would be 6 stories, and that's referred to in the text below on that slide. Next slide, please. We've had in the recent weeks, a number of questions and concerns expressed about the capacity of the council's network to accommodate the increased demand on it from high density residential development, and want to just highlight the planning that council is doing in the context of infrastructure. both wastewater, water supply, but also stormwater. We do plan for infrastructure based on expected growth, and we are continually looking at whether capacity needs to be upgraded to meet expected demand. That will be revisited in light of changes to the district plan, and that will include consideration of the degree and distribution of intensification over the planning horizon. The network is upgraded as demand arises and is funded partly or in full by developers, depending on the situation. Ultimately, council is the infrastructure owner and manager and has the ability to reject proposals where there is not the capacity. And we also are proposing qualifying matters for 3 areas, as previously mentioned in an earlier webinar, namely Shirley, Aranui, and Preston's, where it's not practical and cost prohibitive to upgrade the vacuum sewer networks in those areas. That may be true of those areas, but infrastructure in itself is not a reason to preclude other areas from intensifying if there is the ability to upgrade it. Next slide, please. We're also conscious of the recent events that are still current in Auckland and the wider North Island, and which has highlighted the risks of urban development and the impact of stormwater management. And the plan change does include a number of qualifying matters which reflect existing layers in the district plan to manage flood risk. That includes existing high flood hazard management areas and flood ponding management areas. Just a correction, the reference to QM relating to flood management areas is not the case, but flood management areas do provide the ability to require floor levels to be set and to have controls on earthworks. Council does, of course, have a range of tools and powers beyond that to limit the effects of development outside the district plan, and that includes the Building Act. Bylaws, we need to give approval to connecting to the network and for any works in floodplains. So ultimately, through bylaws, other mechanisms under the Drainage Act and the Local Government Act, we do have the discretion to not approve proposals where they could give rise to adverse effects, and we'll continue to use those existing controls outside the district plan. Next slide, please. Just a brief note to acknowledge that the Heritage Plan Change, Plan Change 13, was approved for public notification in September. It was followed, however, by a resolution that staff worked to integrate to still achieve a consistent approach of notifying them together. And so we are proceeding with notification of Plan Change 13 alongside 14, subject to council decision. And the heritage provisions as per the Resource Management Act take immediate legal effect from notification, and that's regardless of the enabling housing legislation. The hearing on Plan Change 13 will be subject to a standard Schedule 1 process and will follow on from Plan Change 14, and will, like any other plan change, council will have the decision to approve or decline it with rights of appeal to the Environment Court. Next slide, please. So just clarifying, there's been questions about the role of the investigator, but also questions about the role of council. Council must still notify the plan change, and the decision to approve it for notification sits with council. It's not subject to approval of the investigator or the minister. Notwithstanding that, the minister can intervene if council were to not approve it for notification and can appoint someone to notify it. Next slide, please. The council does want to provide an opportunity for participation through the process and is proposing a period of 30 working days for submissions from the 17th of March. The period between the council meeting of the 1st of March and the 17th of March is to allow time for planning and mail out to all properties in the city affected the information they need to have. The ministry is funding a friend of the submitter service, Jane West, who is already helping Selwyn and Waimakariri, and she'll be able to help people explain to people how to make a submission and what different parts of the submission form mean and so forth, but won't be able to advise on the merits of individual submission points nor write the submission for them. We are, however, in discussions with the Community Law Canterbury Centre about providing additional assistance beyond that. In terms of having your say, subject to Council's approval, this provides for this notification and allows the public to have their say. It's important to make a submission if you have views on the plan change and before the closing date. Furthermore, and after the submissions periods have finished, the independent hearings panel that's been appointed will provide an inclusive forum for the public to be heard and to participate. Next slide and final slide from me before questions. So in terms of the timeline, Council will receive a report and determine whether to notify the plan changes on the 1st of March. On the 17th of March, MDRS, the plan change will be notified, allowing for submissions, and in terms of its effect, that is delayed until qualifying matters, that is delayed given the qualifying matter on sunlight access, which effectively means that medium density residential standards would not take effect until decisions are made at the end of the process. The investigator, Mr. John Hardy, by the end of March is to submit his final report to the Associate Minister for the Environment, and his recommendations will take account of Council's decision. Thereafter, we expect that the summary of decisions that have been sought in the submissions will be summarised, and further submissions invited for 10 working days over June, July, and that will be before the panel starts to hear submissions, which is expected to be on October, November next year. We've assumed 2 months for hearings on the basis of the level of public interest, and that will be then back to Council for a decision in likely April. And if the Council approves those recommendations, that is the end of the process. If the Council rejects those recommendations, then the Minister for the Environment has the ultimate decision. That is all from me, and I'm happy to take questions in the time remaining.
Thanks, Mark and David, for your presentation, and everyone watching for the questions that you have sent through. We've shared a lot of details with you, and a reminder that the slides will be made available on our website probably early next week. However, the exact geographic detail of qualifying matters will not be available until the report that is going to Council is made public as part of the meeting agenda, and you will be notified when that is available. I'll now start firing through those questions and see how many we can get answered in the short time that we have available. We will be finishing promptly at 1 p.m. So first one we have is a new RMA issue time still next year. I think that Mark's already covered that, showing that April date. Mark, jump in if that's incorrect. I'll move to the next one. Has there been a solution to blanket qualifying matters? That can't be left unresolved for a year or more. There are too many projects treading water, looking for direction. Mark, if you...
Yeah, so as I've outlined, a number of new qualifying matters proposed that would, and in the instance of the sunlight access, would apply across the whole city. The Act, the Enabling Housing Amendment Act, is quite clear that if a qualifying matter affects an area, then it means that MDRS doesn't take effect until decisions are made. So the effect of that is MDRS wouldn't come into effect until then, and proposals up until that time will be assessed against the operative district plan.
Brilliant, thanks Mark. I think this is another one for you as well. The main idea behind the MDRS was to make it so that consents could be achieved without applying for a resource consent. Should I be angry that I now am told to wait until after March 1st and we might be able to get a resource consent based on the outcome of the March meeting? Also, will the planning team lose workers, i.e. face layoffs, if the MDRS were to take full effect?
So in terms of the first part, the proposed qualifying matters will be tested through the forthcoming process, and there may be additional qualifying matters sought by submissions and tested through the hearings. I've just explained the timing of the effects. So in effect, MDRS will not take effect from the 1st of March, as would otherwise be the case if there was not qualifying matters. The impact of MDRS on workloads has not been considered, and I can't comment further on that.
No, fair enough. One more question. I think this is for you as well, Mark. So mandated recession planes, or maybe might be David, and thus avoid having any qualifying matters. Would we mandate recession planes, I guess, would seem more appropriate for these areas to have higher recession planes.
I'll hand that one over to Dave.
Yeah, apologies. I think that question's gone slightly off my screen. Are the high density zones around commercial centres going to have, oh, sorry. No, that was the entirety of the question. Sorry, over to you, Dave.
I think in any case, Dave covered the proposed recession plans in the high density zones earlier, so we can move on.
Oh, okay, here is a long one. Apologies, bear with me. Can any part of the medium density plan be implemented sooner rather than later, i.e. parts that CCC are not intending to change? The reasons for this is that CCC is holding up a number of projects over the next year, and there are costs associated with that. There should be mechanisms in place to implement the MDRS rules now, excluding the contentions, i.e. the recession planes. Do we have to wait another year? I think that you can answer that one, Mark. The ball's out of our court on that one, isn't it?
Yeah, unless the independent hearings panel were to make a decision that a certain aspect of the proposal, such as the recession plan, were to be decided earlier, but that's for the independent hearings panel to determine.
Lovely. The date of PC14 being notified. Hopefully you've got that. It'll be in the slide pack. If not, that you get, so 17th of March. We have the same sunlight hours as Waimakariri and Selwyn, who both have already enabled MDRS. How do you explain the difference to these authorities?
So the councils on the Greater Christchurch Partnership, namely Selwyn and Waimakariri, have been given consideration to what Christchurch City Council is investigating, and no doubt they'll be working through their own processes, including consideration of submissions, which may raise similar issues, and no doubt there'll be evidence presented to the panel on the merits of applying there as well.
Yes, yeah, it's with, they're at a different part of their process, but they're still very much in the process, aren't they? Why have you used Auckland as a baseline rather than Wellington or Selwyn for that matter?
Dave, over to you.
So it's because the majority of the MDRS development sites are in the Upper North Island, and there's a significant difference between the impact of shading in those cities, which comprise the majority of where development will take place, than in Christchurch. So we think that we're affected in a different way to most places where MDRS applies.
Thanks, Dave. So further on to that, this will be another one for you then, Dave. Why not compare sunlight angles with other international cities, New York, Seattle, Amsterdam, where they've already successfully intensified? Can the international approach be looked at through cities in a similar sunlight position to Christchurch, who are slightly bigger?
The answer to that is that it's difficult to use an international comparison because the planning environment and also what people expect from their cities is very different in those areas. We're quite constrained by the MDRS and how we're entitled to deal with these issues. Recession planes are the only tool that we really have available, whereas in Amsterdam they would be using a different mechanism where they would probably have a design code and not necessarily have any by right development. That's not really an option here.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to ask just one more question, I'm afraid, but rest assured that all the rest of those questions will get the attention that they deserve and will be answered in full and provided in writing. I think there were some questions I'd like to answer in the room around flooding. In light of what's happened in Auckland, how are we going to make sure that development happens in a way that is not subject to further flooding?
So it's certainly been front of mind with the events in the North Island, but also has been front of mind in the past, and the district plan does have a number of controls in areas affected by flood risk. There has been a subsequent question about flood risk being mitigated by setting appropriate floor levels. In the areas where there is flooding, higher floor levels can mitigate the risk to an extent, but there are areas where depths of flooding can cause a risk to life and property, and we don't want to put more people in harm's way. And so on that basis, there are controls that restricts or avoids new development and subdivision in the current district plan, and they would be qualifying matters as part of this intensification plan change.
Lovely, thanks, Mark. So again, apologies, we have run out of time. If we can just flick through to that final slide. If you think of anything following the webinar, that any pressing issues that you would like to have answered, you can still ask us questions. We've got the other session this evening. We'll combine all of those questions together and create one document so you can see what everyone has been asking and how we've responded. Just to reiterate Mark's comments around the process going forward, there is a very diverse range of views out there in the community, and if you want to make sure that your voice is heard, you must put in a submission, and only people who put in a submission are eligible for those further rounds of consultation. So if you feel strongly, make sure we hear from you. Thank you everybody for attending on your lunchtime. If you do want to attend this afternoon's webinar, that's at 5 o'clock. Following the session, we will also send you a link to provide feedback. We've had some great feedback to date, but we're always looking to improve our webinars. So please let us know if there is anything that we could do better. I will be in touch with you shortly via email. Ngā mihi nui from myself and the webinar team. Have a lovely afternoon.